if you want.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The answer is there are some that it's easy to say. Obviously, petroleum, coal, even natural gas are not really renewable. But then when you go to some other ones, yes, you can say wind is renewable, hydro is renewable. But for example, nuclear, is that renewable? I mean, it's still dependent on mining, war, and all of the problems that has associated with it. It's not just environmental impact in the mining and the processing and eventually in going into the production, even though the generation is not so problematic actually. But is it renewable? We may actually, if we stick to the model of fission, there may be some limitations. If we go, for example, to renewable sources such as biomass, is that renewable when in fact we may be, for example, growing sugarcane and other food sources in order to generate ethanol and other biodiesel and so on? That actually has a lot of impact on our farmland. In the United States, farmland is a renewable resource that is not being replenished as fast as it is being drawn down because it's being used intensively to grow crops, corn that goes into ethanol and other farm products. So the definition there is somewhat questionable. And if we're looking into changes going out into not just 2030, but maybe 2050, the end of the century, are indeed some of these energy sources that rely, for example, on growing crops really renewable? I have my doubts. And indeed, even though I think those can grow tremendously because, of course, a lot of the third world, Africa, Asia, and of course, South America, which is already a big bioenergy producer in terms of crops, that can grow significantly, but maybe there are some limits that we might begin going up against middle of the century, something like that, because it's very difficult to imagine that we can continue doing that forever. That's a very good question. So let me just say this. I put together some thoughts on renewables and alternative energy sources in relation to fossil fuels, because
Mm-hmm.
I consider nuclear very important. I consider bioenergy very important. And even though the definitions may be a little gray, I think this is what we're looking at when we speak about the energy transition.
So when we call renewable, we mean that you can recover cycles forever, or what's exactly
Yeah,
the concept?
okay, that's brings up another problem. Wind farms and solar energy generation farms, they may be employing renewable energy, but are they renewable? They don't last forever. You can't just put up a wind farm and it has a 25-year lifetime,
Yeah.
might be extended a little bit. Solar farms, the same thing. The panels themselves, they're not eternal. And if you have to recycle them after 20, 30 years, okay, maybe you can recover some of the materials in that and help produce new ones. But I would suggest that that's not a definition of really renewable. It's something that maybe you can reuse and try to extend. But we have a lot of problems in considering things renewable when it's just going away from fossil fuels, which are definitely not renewable, but we tend to lump everything into renewable. Well, they're not. And if we look at the long term,
Mhm.
30,
So
50 years from now, that's a problem.
that's a problem. So the source may be renewable, but the equipment
Certainly
has
not.
cycle. Yeah.
And they have serious impacts. So the reason to go to renewables is because we want to reduce the impacts into the environment and so on. And in fact, when you look at the life cycle of these energy sources, which personally I think is very interesting to have wind energy projects in Brazil, for example. The Northeast is very favorable. Obviously, the North Sea and many other regions in the world, but it's maybe an illusion to think of this as completely renewable energy
Yeah.
resource, because of course to replace a lot of that investment in 20 or 30 years, or even if it's 35, may be very expensive, and that may throw all of those calculations off by quite a lot.
Yeah. I'm seeing that you have three slides here, so please go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I have one that I wanted to put up here. This does show some of the trends that we've had in levelized energy costs, which is a good measure of average energy costs, of trying to analyze how some of these energy sources have developed in the last 10 years or more. Obviously, fossil fuels the cost basically depends on where the oil prices are, but in general they haven't fundamentally changed up or down, because the technology basically is the same in generation and in using oil and gas. So those are have been kind of stable, and in this shaded area you see more or less what fossil fuel energy costs have been and what they're expected to be. That's a good basis range to keep in mind, because ultimately any renewable or alternative energy sources, even if they're not really renewable but maybe they can last a long time, they have to come up with economic considerations in order for them to be implemented. I mentioned in many of my talks that subsidies alone cannot drive major changes, fundamental and historical changes. You might try to accelerate that, or at the beginning, you might try to provide some incentives for technology development. But ultimately, what makes the changes come into being is costs. And if
No
the
doubt.
technology can bring down costs to near the range of what this gray area is, which is fossil fuels, then things will be easy, because the market will take care of implementing those energy alternatives because they make sense. In a lot of cases, this is happening nowadays. And as we can see, for example, on the right, offshore wind and onshore wind, they have come down in price a lot. Sure, at the beginning, with a lot of incentives, and there's some still there, but the costs are so low that the industry will continue to implement offshore wind projects, onshore wind projects wherever feasible. The constraints there, and which are not shown in this graph, are really, as I have mentioned many times, materials costs, because this is what the cost of setting up a new wind farm is in terms of the generators and the blades and all of this stuff. But maybe
Yeah.
the actual generator has rare earth elements in its constitution, which may not be available in the quantities that we project if wind farms become 10 or 20% of the world energy mix. So I think these cost numbers are important, but they're not the whole question. I think way before 2050, we'll be coming up against a lot of the materials bottlenecks. Copper, maybe lithium, certainly a lot of
No
the
doubt.
rare earths. These are materials that will be essential to make these things work, and they will not be available in the numbers that we expect, unless, of course, the dollars go up tremendously, and then they will fall out of the range of being competitive. Because if rare earths are not available in sufficient quantities, we're talking about 10, 20 time price increases in some of these estimates for metals and so on. Even things like silver are projected to become in such short supply that they can affect a lot of the circuits and so on which many of these things depend. Certainly the rare earth metals that are needed for the magnets and so on that make these things energy efficient. If you go
Yeah.
back to the technology of the early 20th century, well, sure, you can run a generator with just copper and so on, and even then, copper may be in short supply, but it's nowhere close to being as efficient. So, in order to have efficient equipment, you need these materials. And the big question is, are they going to be there? But if we
Yeah.
look at, say, the next 50 years, I don't think I or anybody else can be very confident if you go out to 2100, because many things can happen, even the availability of materials or new technologies. That's all.
But yeah, let me interrupt you because there is a point you mentioned that's very important for me, for my understanding. So, when you mention economics of each energy, renewable energy, of course you can consider the intermittence as
Yeah.
a
No,
cost,
this is,
or
you can even build
mean the
that in. Yeah.
all in
Yeah.
costs,
Yeah.
including the energy security, maybe
Yeah.
some other factors that could be considered, not only the direct costs. Is it correct or?
Yes, I mean, the intermittency is a factor, and besides that, these costs don't include a lot of the required energy infrastructure that will be required. Transmission and distribution systems throughout the world will have to be upgraded, and on a vast scale. We're talking trillions of dollars, because the energy that will be generated with these new sources is not as it was before. The places where it's generated will be different, and so we need transmission. And then the actual distribution to clients will have to be greatly improved, and investments made in the area, because of course there will be a lot of electrification in terms of conversion of some heat sources into electricity sources. That will require a vast investment in energy distribution systems. So you have transmission and distribution will require tremendous amount of dollars, both in transmission lines and wires and so on, and also in equipment, uh,
Storage,
stabilizers,
including.
yeah, storage, modulators, all of these things that are very um, expensive to do on such a wide scale. You know, the network only works because of this invisible network has been built over 100 years, and it's working well. But if we change our mix very substantially, the network itself will have to be changed, inverters, you know, uh, all kinds of systems to maintain energy stability. The intermittency requires a lot of equipment to take care of that. Even if we go to backup systems, in order to do that, there's equipment required. So the investments are very large. So what I'm saying is that these costs that are shown here, and all the costs that we are able to discuss nowadays, do not take into consideration a lot of the additional costs that will be required in terms of energy network in place, which may be equivalent to the same amount of investment over again just in the network. You know, it's not easy to underestimate those needs. And then, of course, the materials costs, both for the network and for the energy generation, are a question mark. You know, I think those can cause very sharp increases in some materials, maybe not all of them, but those alone might be sufficient to, for example, put a brake on some of the solar development. It's possible. I'm not forecasting that right now, and I think we can easily, as I will mention a little later, we can get to some of the targets that have been discussed, but it's going to be very difficult to go beyond those targets, because there will be materials restrictions in the mining and the processing and the geopolitical risks of where these minerals are. Those are going to be big bottlenecks.
Yeah, no doubt. But wind and solar, I'm not sure about that. They are dominant in terms of renewable. But when we consider alternative energy, nuclear and other can come. So what's the figure you have?
Well, that's where I become a little bit more optimistic because for some reason, even at COP, we're just discussing, you know, going away from fossil fuels into what we know now, which is basically impossible, which is wind and solar, and hydro cannot increase much because we don't have underlying physical potential for that. So as it stands now, there aren't any choices available. But I am very optimistic because the choices that will become available depend on new technologies, which we are basically still developing, and I am very optimistic about the prospects. Certainly for nuclear, um, SMRs, which I know you have discussed in several programs, and I am particularly optimistic about those developments. Sure, that may take 10 or 15 years, but if we're talking 2050 and beyond, that's quite doable. The increments in nuclear energy that would come about from major technology breakthroughs could be very significant. I'm not talking about fusion because I think that's even 50 years. There are some technological breakthroughs in the works, but even those might take 20 years, 30, I don't know. It's very iffy. But the technology breakthroughs that we're just discussing now in fission technology, small nuclear reactors with new fuels, new setups. I think that can bring about order of magnitude increase in the potential. Right now, we have very few nuclear reactors being built in the world. As you know, they're mostly concentrated in China, but I think that
China.
will change drastically. I think the US and even Europe and much of the world will turn to nuclear because there's a nuclear renaissance going on and because of the driver of the technology changes they're making that available. So nuclear will definitely undergo a major change. Later, I'm going to point to some of that. Um, but let me bring up another slide here. Uh, this this is this is a breakdown of the capex of the capital expenditures required to put new hydroelectric into existence nowadays. As I mentioned, the limitations might be the actual places where you can build hydroelectric installations, but the cost parameters are somewhat like this, somewhat under $3,000 per kilowatt of capacity. That is a lot. It's a lot higher than some of the solar and wind, and certainly a lot higher than putting in gas generators and so on. But of course, the characteristics of the hydro projects are that they have extremely long lifetimes. They're not eternally renewable sources because ultimately the reservoirs begin to become filled with sediments and so on, either requiring tremendous expenditure to revive them. So I would say, yeah, maybe 100 or more years in lifetime, but not 100% renewable because they will eventually become inoperable. We are already seeing many hydro projects being dismantled because of many problems, mostly environmental concerns, those regarding the small units. Some of the bigger units have also been underperformers because they have large areas of reservoirs with low uh, capacity. That's not very sustainable. But I wanted to show these numbers because this is what I think is the comparison baseline for a lot of other energies. Um, uh, Under
It's interesting because,
$3,000.
sorry to interrupt you, the three most important costs in this graph are civil works, land acquisition, and generation equipment. So the
Yeah.
most important ones. Interesting.
Yeah, you see, generation equipment will require large turbines and generators, which are magnets and copper and a lot of rare earths. So maybe even in hydro, we might run up into those restrictions that I mentioned in terms of materials, because a hydro plant really is like a wind generator. It's a piece of equipment that has all this copper and materials in it that require mining, and they are in short supply in relation to the growing demand. But if we say, oh, let's not worry about that yet, especially because hydro cannot really grow much. But it gives you an idea of what the cost breakdown is. And if you compare other alternatives to this, then you say, if you want to install something that's going to be long lasting, it's good base production because it runs 24 hours, 7 days a week, 30,
Uh-huh.
30 days a month, basically all year, except in regions like Brazil and others where you have some seasonal variations. But this is the gold standard. And so when you have other alternatives which are much less expensive, yes, but there's something you give up. Obviously, maybe they don't last as long or they're intermittent and so on. But there's also the question of many other uh, renewables and alternative sources which are much higher capital expenditure per kilowatt than hydro. And then you have to ask yourself, if all of the investment that's being questioned now into oil and gas and so on were to be turned over into something like this gold standard of hydro generation, you would not have one third of the energy required, because it is this number is three times or more expensive in capital expenditure than fossil fuel generation.
Yeah,
And in many
that's right.
cases, fossil fuel is much, much cheaper. So this is a
Wow.
gold standard that we cannot ignore. Yes, there's other, wind and solar a little bit less, but even so, they're of course more expensive than the fossil fuel generation capital expenditures required.
And there is a very, very interesting point that I'm happy because I can see contingency costs. It's the first time that I see
You
this
like that?
approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love this concept of contingency. What
You
does
see,
it mean
it's maybe
contingency?
not
Yeah,
major, but in some other sources, it would be very important. And this is the thing, you have to consider all of these. This is a work produced by Thunder Said, and they were excellent in reviewing a lot of these projects and new sources, because you have to be realistic. As I was telling you, you don't have to be one of these guys that is wishing for the end of the fossil fuels and the end of the oil age, and that are determined to uh, go into renewables 100%, because that is illusory. But you still have to be able to constructively talk about renewables, energy transition, and energy alternatives to fossil fuels, because this is a reality of the current economy. A lot of the oil and gas majors, for example, are dedicating significant
yeah.
parts of their budgets into
So,
alternative energy.
some of these reactions, I'm not sure about that, but are result of the pressure in terms of media,
Yeah,
society. So it's
this
not
was
only economics.
this was the pressure originally when BP went into Beyond Petroleum. That was a pressure. I don't think they actually uh, would welcome that when they look at the technical aspects
Mhm.
of the alternatives, with the high risks and high uncertainty that all of the renewables and uh, unconventional sources would entail. And that has happened again nowadays. For example, at COP, there's tremendous pressure, and that pressure is not based on technical aspects. So the danger is that we are doing policy that is not paying attention to technical underlying um, realities. Constraints in materials, constraints in availability of those sources, constraints in the length of time that these alternative and renewable sources actually work. Even wind farms, they stop after a while and you have to renew them and replace them. This is a reality. That's why we have to discuss this. Whether we agree with the trend or not, we have to be able to put some numbers and say, where does this make sense? And there are some alternative and renewable sources that make sense now. And with available investment dollars for renewables to be invested, we have a priority list in which to invest. But if you just decide to invest all of the capital expenditure that's going nowadays into oil and gas and invest it in alternative energy sources, you come up with
Yeah.
one third, one quarter of what you need. And then, of course, nobody is prepared to have a life changing in the quality of life and the way of life. So this is very important baseline. And because of this, I just came up and I can show you this. It's just look at where coal, oil, gas, and other fossil fuels, they cannot disappear by 2050. I think it is possible to achieve net zero, whether one is in ideological agreement or not. It is possible, and I think it's actually likely that we can achieve that. But oil and gas will still be a
Will
significant
remain,
part
sure.
of the
Especially
answer.
for petrochemical solutions, that there is no solution for that
Exactly.
yet.
Even if there's alternatives in biofuels, yes, they will be there and they won't disappear for a long time. So I'm just throwing a number that's somewhat like the IEA and so on suggests. They think, oh, a very aggressive scenario could reduce that. I don't think that's going to happen. But
Uh-huh.
hydro, which is, considered very clean, it's long lasting, like I said, I don't think it's renewable in the sense that it still has a lifetime of 100 plus years, but it's not 1,000 or 2,000. It can remain more or less where it is because it can grow a little bit, but in relative terms, it also will decrease a little bit because other sources are growing much more. Bioenergy is an area which I think Brazil has shown the way because of the large contribution of ethanol from sugarcane and other crops, and biodiesel from
Yeah.
several crops, from soybeans and others. And there are many countries that can follow that same trajectory. Sure, food necessities may be a
Yeah.
limiting factor, but there's a lot of areas that are currently unproductive that can be changed into cultivation for bioenergy sources. So that I believe can be an upside, maybe up to 10%. Um, Wind and solar, yes, maybe they're making those predictions of 10 and 15%. They can get there. I think it would be very difficult at that rate to increase much because those numbers will require tremendous amounts of materials which we are
Mining.
just not prepared to produce easily. So that will be a very big challenge. But let's say that we can get there. Nuclear, I think, I'm very positive, and 15% is a lot higher than most people think it can reach. But I think, by 2030 something, certainly by 2050, nuclear can be 15%, maybe more with new technology in small nuclear reactors, and the plain revival of old large plants, but certainly with a completely different technical characteristic, and certainly safe and all of that. Beyond 2050, we may have a problem with current nuclear uh, energy production unless we also begin looking at reuse of fuel or other sources, and certainly fusion is much further out. Um, and the other sources, geothermal is renewable in the sense that the hot under areas under our feet are almost infinite, but it can be called renewable, and it can grow. It's low cost, even in capital expenditures. It's just in its infancy because even though it has existed for a long time, no one has paid much attention, and now it's undergoing a revival, and I think it will grow a lot. And the other, maybe that will be 5-10%. And the other sources, and I've spoken to you before, is white and gold hydrogen. Hydrogen from natural sources, which no one was paying attention to before, and hydrogen from depleted oil and gas reservoirs. Everybody's talking about green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, but those are energy inefficient. And I think, they can have investment and money can go into that. But in 5 years' time, we'll see that that's not where the future is. It's really in other types of hydrogen, and that can grow very fast because hydrogen is very available in both of those sources. So I think this is more or less the outlook. But like I said, the devil is in the details. Now, when we start looking at each industry to get there, there's a whole lot of discussion involved.
This exercise of prediction is fantastic. I like the point of constrained by materials. That's a very
Yeah.
hard truth. And wind and solar are very sensible for materials exploration. I mean, the mining, etc. Yeah, very interesting.
And you see, when people talk about lithium production in South America and the United States, yes, that's very good. We will be able to grow lithium production a lot, but I do not even think that it's lithium that will be the major choke point because a lot of the new technologies in batteries, for example, are not lithium based, sodium based and so on. So it's important that we're beginning to feel what a material constraint feels like. And that's lithium currently, and maybe for the next 5-10 years. But the other constraints are coming, 10 years from now, and they will apply to the actual generators that we use to make any kind of basic energy into electricity. And those will be much more difficult to overcome. Certainly copper, silver, and rare earths are going to be very difficult to substitute. So they will remain as a very serious material risk to energy transition.
Yeah. Okay, going to the conclusions, but inserting a question for you in terms of technology development of technology. I mean, the ongoing research and the probability of disruptions in terms of
Yeah.
technologies. Do you see? Of course, it's very difficult to predict the disruption, but
Yeah.
there is a moment for disruption, the
Well,
environment for.
actually, I think that the moment is now. Artificial intelligence, I think, will be the driver for a lot of the new technology breakthroughs because that is what is allowing us to discover alternatives in materials. Just as in new drugs and so on, artificial intelligence is telling us, which compounds can be effective against what illness and so on. The same thing can apply to materials in equipment, what materials can reduce energy losses, good transmissibility, energy efficiency can gain with the use of such materials. We're seeing that. And that's in the next 5 years. We will see tremendous change in this efficiency driven by artificial intelligence, providing us with technology alternatives. Beyond that, yes, technology will continue to develop, and I even suggest that breakthroughs will come as they have come in the past, unexpectedly, and I don't think it will be fusion that will be the big surprise, but that could be one of them. I don't know when. It's
But it will
not
take
now,
time.
but it could be in 10 years. Who knows? That's a big question. Yeah, difficult to answer.
Yeah, yeah, I know that. Yeah, that's the reason I make for you. Ah, fantastic. This last picture that we have on the screen now is very important because it's a kind of prediction or a perception of Professor Cleveland Jones about the future of energy, participation of each energy in the
Cavagna, I'm
architecture.
so
Yes.
happy that 30 years from now, I'm not going to be around. So if I'm wrong,
Me
who
too.
cares?
Yeah, yeah, very good. Professor Cleveland Jones, was a pleasure. It's a fantastic topic today, the changing mix of renewables. And we covered, in my opinion, the core of this issue, this theme. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you, Cavagna. Bye
It's a
bye.
pleasure, great pleasure.